a marriage choice that echoes across generations. The hidden psychology behind relationship cutoffs. There is an old proverb that says, "A wise wife honors 3 generations." A destructive wife can ruin a man's entire life. At first glance, this may sound like a harsh judgment about a person. But the deeper meaning of this proverb is not about blaming one individual. It is about something far more structural. It is a warning about the nature of marriage as a decision that extends far beyond 2 people. Marriage is not simply a romantic choice. It is a long-term social system that links families, values, expectations, and future generations. When a person chooses a spouse, they are not only choosing a partner for today, they are choosing the emotional climate of their household, the relational structure their children will inherit, and the long arc of stability or instability that may follow for decades. In other words, marriage is a generational decision disguised as a personal one. The mistake many parents make. When parents observe their child's relationship, they often focus on what is immediately visible. They see the present moment. They see emotions. They see arguments. They see temporary tension. But what they often fail to see is something deeper, the pattern behind the behavior. The real question is not, are they fighting right now? The real question is, how do they deal with conflict? Because the way a person handles conflict reveals the operating philosophy of their life. And by the time someone reaches their late 30s, that philosophy is rarely accidental. It has usually hardened into a worldview. When cutting off relationships becomes a worldview. In early adulthood, cutting off relationships can still be situational. A person in their 20s or early 30s might distance themselves from someone because of a particular event, a misunderstanding, a painful conflict, a temporary emotional reaction. At that stage, disconnection is often a decision. But as people approach their late 30s, something subtle begins to change. Disconnection stops being a reaction. It starts becoming a system. It becomes a way of organizing life. And once that shift happens, the question is no longer, why did they do that? The real question becomes, will they keep doing it? Because when a behavior turns into a worldview, repetition becomes predictable. 3 patterns that reveal the shift. In individuals who frequently cut off relationships, 3 patterns often appear by the late 30s. These patterns are not random. They form a recognizable psychological structure. 1. Repeated history of relationship cutoffs. By this stage, disconnection is rarely happening for the first time. These individuals often have a long history of ending relationships abruptly. They may say things like, "I once cut off all my old friends at once. Looking back, it was the right decision." Or, "There are several relatives I simply don't see anymore. Life is easier that way." Or even, "If someone makes me uncomfortable at work, I just draw a clear line and keep my distance." In these cases, cutting someone off is not seen as dramatic. It becomes a normal tool for managing life. 2. Radical simplification of social circles. Another common pattern is the extreme reduction of relationships. These individuals often say, "I only keep in touch with a few people now. That's all I need." Or, "I stopped going to gatherings. It's just unnecessary energy." Or, "I only see family members who are easy to deal with." What is important here is the interpretation. They do not see this shrinking social circle as isolation. They see it as clarity. To them, it feels like cleaning a cluttered room. Removing people is interpreted as organizing life. 3. A philosophy of only comfortable people. The final and most decisive stage occurs when disconnection becomes a moral principle. At this point, people begin to articulate their approach as a life philosophy. You might hear statements like, "I only keep people around who make me comfortable." Or, "There is no reason to maintain relationships that feel stressful." Or, "As you get older, you need to filter people out." Once this belief solidifies, a powerful mental shortcut appears. Every relationship is evaluated through a single question. Is this person comfortable for me or not? If the answer is no, the conclusion becomes simple. the relationship should end. Why behavior becomes predictable. This is why individuals in their late 30s with strong disconnection patterns are often highly predictable. Not because they are irrational, but because they are internally consistent. 3 psychological forces have already shaped their mindset. 1. They have repeatedly ended relationships before. 2. They remember feeling relief after doing so. 3. They reinterpret those decisions as wise life choices. Through repetition, disconnection stops feeling like loss. Instead, it feels like control. Ending the relationship becomes a way of restoring personal authority. A person may internally think, I ended that situation. I took my power back. Over time, the brain remembers this sense of control. And when the next conflict appears, the same strategy naturally returns. The language of modern psychology. Another interesting transformation occurs at this stage. The act of cutting people off begins to be explained through the language of modern psychology. Instead of saying, I couldn't stand the situation, people now say things like, I needed healthy boundaries, or that relationship was toxic, or I refused to do emotional labor for others. These terms often come from real psychological concepts, but when internalized too rigidly, they can transform a coping strategy into a permanent life rule. Now the decision is no longer emotional. It becomes framed as logical, mature, and morally justified. When marriage becomes a conditional system, this mindset also reshapes marriage itself. Earlier in life, marriage tends to function as a process of negotiation. 2 people adjust, they compromise, they gradually build shared rules. But when someone enters marriage with a fully developed disconnection philosophy, the structure changes. Marriage becomes a conditional system. Certain expectations are clearly defined from the beginning. How often families should meet, how much involvement parents should have, what counts as interference. On the surface, these boundaries can appear very reasonable. The real issue lies in something subtle. They are not negotiable guidelines. They are fixed conditions. And once a conflict is interpreted as violating those conditions, the relationship moves rapidly toward distance. Why this matters. The purpose of analyzing these patterns is not to condemn anyone. Human relationships are complex. Everyone develops coping strategies based on past experiences. However, when a strategy hardens into a worldview, its consequences become structural. A worldview shapes every future decision. This is why understanding these patterns is important for parents, partners, and individuals themselves, because by the time a philosophy of relationships becomes fully formed, it rarely changes easily. What appears to be a small relational conflict may actually be the visible surface of a much deeper psychological framework. And when that framework prioritizes removal over reconciliation, the future of relationships becomes surprisingly predictable. If this structural perspective on relationships helped you see the issue more clearly, consider sharing this discussion with others who might benefit from thinking about relationships, not just emotionally, but philosophically and structurally. And if you enjoy deep explorations of psychology, philosophy, and the hidden structures of human relationships, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share the channel. Because sometimes understanding human behavior is not about judging people. It is about seeing the patterns that quietly shape our lives. When relationship philosophy becomes destiny, the predictable structure of late-formed relationship patterns. In the previous discussion, explored a critical shift that occurs in human relationships. At a certain stage in life, patterns stop being temporary reactions and begin to solidify into personal philosophies. Once that happens, behavior becomes surprisingly predictable. And this is exactly where our discussion now continues. When we look at individuals in their late 30s who display strong patterns of relational cutoff, we are not observing someone who is still experimenting with life. We are observing someone who has already traveled quite far in one direction. Their beliefs about relationships have been tested repeatedly. Their coping strategies have been reinforced over time, and their conclusions about how life should be managed have already been formed. In other words, they are not standing at the beginning of change. They are standing at the end of a psychological journey that has already taken shape. Because of that, they may appear emotionally strong, decisive, and confident. But from a structural perspective, something else is happening at the same time. Their relational framework has become rigid. The flexibility that allows relationships to evolve gradually begins to disappear. And paradoxically, the stronger the emotional certainty appears, the more predictable the behavioral pattern becomes. An old warning about the collapse of families. There is another ancient proverb that speaks directly to this issue. When a household is destined to collapse, it often begins with the arrival of a person who rejects the moral balance of relationships. In classical texts, this figure was sometimes described using the term Yao Fu, often translated as a destructive or disruptive woman. But the meaning of this term is often misunderstood. It does not refer to someone dramatic, seductive, or malicious in a superficial sense. Rather, it describes a particular style of managing relationships. The warning is not about personality. It is about relational philosophy. A person becomes destabilizing not because they are loud or aggressive, but because they operate with three underlying principles. They reject the idea of adjusting relationships. They refuse the process of mutual negotiation. And they treat their personal standards as absolute rules. When those three principles combine inside a family system, the structure becomes fragile. Not immediately, but gradually, because family stability relies on something subtle yet essential: the ability to absorb discomfort without breaking the relationship. When that ability disappears, every disagreement becomes a potential fracture, while late-stage disconnection becomes so strong. The individuals we have been discussing, those who repeatedly cut off relationships in their late 30s, are not necessarily acting out of hatred or resentment. In fact, many of them do not feel angry at all. What they feel instead is certainty. Over time, they have experienced multiple moments where ending a relationship brought them relief. After cutting someone off, their stress decreased, their anxiety disappeared, their life felt simpler. From a psychological standpoint, that experience becomes extremely powerful. The mind learns a simple lesson. When a relationship becomes difficult, removing it restores stability. Once that lesson is reinforced repeatedly, it becomes a strategy. And after enough repetition, the strategy becomes a philosophy of life. At that stage, something interesting happens. The philosophy does not remain emotional. It becomes intellectualized. People begin to explain their choices using the language of psychology, self-care, and social discourse. They might say things like, "I'm protecting my boundaries. This relationship was unhealthy. Adults shouldn't tolerate toxic dynamics." On the surface, these explanations sound rational, and often they are. But they also serve another function. They transform past emotional decisions into a coherent worldview. This process gives the individual moral clarity. And once that clarity forms, reversing direction becomes extremely difficult. The predictability of future choices. This is why the behavior of individuals at this stage becomes so predictable. The future no longer requires new decisions. It simply repeats the same internal logic. If conflict arises, three patterns tend to appear almost automatically. First, the conflict is interpreted structurally rather than emotionally. Instead of thinking, "Perhaps this was a misunderstanding," the interpretation becomes, "This relationship itself is fundamentally incompatible." Second, dialogue becomes less important. If the problem is defined as structural, conversation seems pointless, because in their view, structures do not change through discussion. And third, if the relationship fails to meet their standards, it is eventually removed. Not impulsively, but decisively. The question parents must ask. For parents observing their children's marriages or relationships, this creates a difficult emotional challenge. Hope is a powerful instinct. Parents naturally want to believe that tensions will soften over time, that maturity will bring flexibility, that relationships will eventually stabilize. But when a relational philosophy has already solidified, hope alone is not enough. The more important question becomes structural rather than emotional. Not, will things get better someday? But can this relational structure remain stable for the next 30 years? Because marriage is not a short-term emotional event. It is a long-term social system, and systems behave according to their internal design. Looking ahead. The purpose of this analysis is not to blame individuals or create fear. Human beings are shaped by their experiences. Everyone develops strategies for protecting themselves from pain. But when those strategies evolve into fixed philosophies, they begin to shape the future in predictable ways. Understanding those patterns allows families to move from emotional reaction to thoughtful judgment. And that is exactly where our next discussion will go. In the next part of this series, we will examine a difficult but important question. How should parents realistically evaluate a marriage when these patterns are already visible? We will also explore the most common misunderstandings parents have when judging relationships at different ages. Because the goal is not pessimism. The goal is clarity, to see marriage not only through the lens of hope, but also through the lens of long-term relational structure. If this discussion has helped you think about relationships from a deeper philosophical perspective, consider supporting the conversation. Subscribe, like, and share the discussion with others who may be facing similar questions. Because sometimes the most important decisions in life are not made through emotion alone, but through the quiet ability to recognize patterns before they repeat.